Marji 1943 Atlantic Ocean? A German U-boat commander stares through his periscope at the largest convoy he has ever seen, 60 merchant ships stretching across the horizon. He should be celebrating. This is a target-rich environment, a Wolfpack commander's dream. But something is wrong. His crew has been hunting for 3 days and found nothing. Now that they've finally located this massive convoy, they can't get close. There are destroyers everywhere. Last month, his boat sank 4 ships from a convoy, half this size. This month, he'll be lucky to survive the depth charge attack that's coming. Across the Atlantic, dozens of U-boat captains are experiencing the same inexplicable phenomenon. The bigger the convoys get, the harder they are to attack. It defies logic. It defies tactics. It defies everything the Kriegsmarine taught them. And it asks all because of one British mathematician who proposed an idea so insane that Royal Navy admirals called him a madman. Make the convoys bigger. The year was 1941, and Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. Not slowly, not gradually, but catastrophically. German U-boats were sending Allied merchant ships to the bottom of the ocean faster than shipyards could replace them, and the mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. If the current loss rate continued, Britain would run out of food, fuel, and ammunition before it could possibly defeat Nazi Germany. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later write that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war, and with good reason. The island nation that ruled a quarter of the world was being strangled by submarines, and every conventional tactical response the Royal Navy attempted seemed to make the problem worse rather than better. Convoys were the established defense against submarine warfare grouping merchant ships. Together with naval escorts had been standard practice since World War I, but they were dying anyway. Small convoys of 20 to 30 ships were being decimated by coordinated Wolfpack attacks. U-boat commanders would shadow convoys for days, call in their packmates, and launch synchronized night surface attacks that overwhelmed the escorts and slaughtered merchant vessels. The loss statistics were unsustainable in 1941 alone. U-boats sank over 4 million tons of Allied shipping, and the trend was accelerating. The Admiralty's response followed centuries of naval logic. Keep convoys small and dispersed to avoid presenting concentrated targets. Rely on speed and evasion, and accept that a certain percentage of losses was inevitable in warfare. But into this desperate situation walked Patrick Blackett, a physicist who had won the Nobel Prize for his work on cosmic rays, and who had absolutely no formal naval training whatsoever. The Admiralty had reluctantly allowed him to form an operational research section out. Fancy term for civilians using mathematics and statistics to analyze military problems, but naval officers viewed him and his team of scientists with deep suspicion. These were men who had spent their careers at sea, who understood naval warfare through instinct and experience, being second-guessed by university professors with slide rules and probability theories. Blackett's initial work focused on anti-submarine warfare tactics, and his team had already produced controversial findings that challenged naval orthodoxy. They'd proven mathematically that setting depth charges to explode at shallower depths increased kill rates of finding. That seemed counterintuitive because U-boats could dive deeper, but which worked because most attacks happened when submarines were still near the surface. They'd calculated the optimal search patterns for hunting submarines and demonstrated that aircraft painted white instead of dark colors were statistically harder for U-boats to spot against cloud backgrounds. Naval officers had grudgingly accepted these findings because they were backed by combat data, but they were minor tactical adjustments. What Blackett proposed next was a tactical tweak. It was a fundamental challenge to the entire strategic conception of convoy operations, and it sounded absolutely insane. Make the convoys bigger, not slightly bigger. Much bigger! Double or triple their size! Combine 40, 50, 60 merchant ships into single formations instead of the current 20 to 30 ship convoys. When Blackett first presented this proposal to Admiralty officials, their response was immediate and hostile. The idea violated every instinct of naval warfare dating back to the age of sail. Concentrating ships made them easier targets! A U-boat commander who found a large convoy had more targets to choose from and could sink more ships in a single attack. It was suicide, presenting the enemy with a concentrated killing field where they could maximize damage. The objections came fast. Larger convoys would be easier to detect, harder to maneuver, would take longer to form up in port, would create bottlenecks in loading and unloading, and would result in catastrophic losses when wolf packs inevitably found them. Blackett listened to these objections, nodded politely, and then proceeded to demolish them with mathematics that most of the naval officers in the room could UND fully follow, but could UND effectively refute. The core of Blackett's argument rested on probability theory and geometric relationships that seemed obvious once explained, but had somehow eluded every naval strategist who thought about convoy operations. Detection probability, he demonstrated, was primarily a function of the convoy's perimeter, not its area or the number of ships it contained. A U-boat searching an empty ocean had a certain probability of detecting a convoy based on how much ocean the Convoy's perimeter crossed through during the U-boat's search pattern. When you doubled the number of ships in a convoy, it didn't undouble this perimeter. The perimeter increased far more slowly because ships were packed more densely within the formation. The mathematical relationship was roughly that perimeter increased with the square root of the number of ships. This meant a convoy of 60 ships had a perimeter only about 1.4 times larger than a convoy of 30 ships, despite having twice as many vessels. In practical terms, a 60-ship convoy was not significantly more likely to be detected than a 30-ship convoy, but it contained twice as many targets. The implications were staggering. If detection probability remained roughly constant regardless of convoy size, but the number of ships in each convoy doubled, you could move the same amount of cargo with half as many convoys. Fewer convoys meant fewer opportunities for U-boats to make contact. Fewer contacts meant fewer attacks. Fewer attacks meant fewer ships sunk. But Blackett's analysis didn't stop there. He added another layer that made the proposal even more compelling: escort efficiency. Naval escorts, destroyers, corvettes, frigates were in desperately short supply. There weren't enough to adequately protect all the convoys crossing the Atlantic. Under the current system, a 30-ship convoy might have 6 escorts, a ratio of 5 merchant ships per escort, but escorts protected the perimeter of a convoy, not individual ships. If you doubled the convoy size to 60 ships, you didn't need to double the escort force to 12 ships. The perimeter had only increased by 1.4 times, so you might need 8 or 9 escorts instead of 6. The ratio jumped from 5 merchant ships per escort to potentially 7 or 8 merchant ships per escort. The escort density, the number of warships protecting each mile of convoy perimeter, actually increased when convoys got larger. This was the counterintuitive breakthrough that changed everything. Larger convoys were harder to attack, not because they had more escorts in absolute numbers, but because the geometric relationship between convoy perimeter and convoy size meant that escort density increased with convoy size. A U-boat trying to penetrate a 60-ship convoy faced more escorts per mile of perimeter than one attacking a 30-ship convoy. The defensive screen was tighter, the gaps were smaller, and the probability of an undetected approach dropped significantly. Blackett backed up his theoretical mathematics with statistical analysis of actual convoy operations. His team examined hundreds of convoy crossings, cataloging detection rates, attack patterns, loss ratios, and escort effectiveness. The data supported his theory. Larger convoys, in the relatively few instances where they'd been tried, showed lower loss rates per ship than smaller convoys, even when accounting for variables like weather, routes, and escort quality. The mathematics and the empirical evidence aligned perfectly, presenting an argument that was difficult to dismiss despite its violation of conventional wisdom. But institutional resistance in military organizations doesn't yield easily to mathematical proofs, particularly when those proofs come from civilian scientists telling career officers that centuries of naval doctrine are wrong. The debates within the Admiralty were heated and prolonged. Senior officers pointed out practical difficulties. Ports couldn't handle the influx of ships for larger convoys. Loading and unloading schedules would create chaos. Merchant captains weren't trained to maintain station in larger formations, and the logistics of assembling 60 ships simultaneously were nightmarish compared to organizing 30-ship convoys. These weren't theoretical objections, they were real operational challenges that would require significant changes to established procedures. Blackett's response was to calculate whether the operational difficulties of larger convoys would outweigh their tactical advantages, and his mathematics suggested they would not. Yes, ports would need better scheduling. Yes, convoy assembly would take longer. Yes, there would be a learning curve for merchant captains. But none of these challenges changed the fundamental probability equations governing detection and attack. The geometry didn't care about administrative inconvenience. A U-boat commander searching for convoys could detect a 60-ship formation significantly more easily than a 30-ship formation, and if he did find it, he faced a denser escort screen that made successful attacks harder. The operational headaches of implementing larger convoys were temporary and solvable. The mathematical advantages were permanent and substantial. The breakthrough came when Blackett found allies among younger, more analytically minded naval officers who recognized the validity of his mathematics even if it conflicted with their training. These officers began running war games and simulations based on Blackett's parameters, and the results consistently supported his conclusions. In exercises where U-boat tactics were tested against different convoy configurations, larger convoys with proportionally fewer escorts consistently outperformed smaller convoys with the same escort two-ship ride. The evidence became overwhelming enough that even the most traditional admiralty officials couldn't completely dismiss it. The implementation of Blackett's larger convoy strategy began gradually in late 1942 and accelerated through 1943. The Western Approaches Command, responsible for convoy operations in the Atlantic, started experimenting with expanded convoy sizes. The results were dramatic and immediate. Convoys that would previously have been split into 2 or 3 separate formations now sailed as single large units. The initial operational chaos that skeptics had predicted did occur. Ports struggled with scheduling. Merchant captains made station-keeping errors, and there were coordination problems, but these issues resolved quickly as procedures adapted. What didn't resolve, from the German perspective, was the sudden, inexplicable decline in U-boat effectiveness. German submarine commanders began filing increasingly frustrated after-action reports, describing hunting patterns that found nothing, convoys that appeared impossibly well, and attack opportunities that materialized far less frequently than their experience and doctrine suggested they should. Admirado Cadodini, commando of the U-boat force, studied the reports with growing concern. His submarines weren't becoming less effective at individual attacks. When they did find and engage convoys, they still sank ships, but they were finding convoys less often. And when they did make contact, they were sinking fewer ships per engagement before being driven off by escorts or forced to break contact. The mathematics of the U-boat campaign, which had looked so favorable in 1942, suddenly tilted against Germany in ways Dönitz couldn't fully explain. The Germans never figured out what had changed. German naval intelligence knew that Allied convoys were getting larger, but they interpreted this as a logistical necessity driven by port congestion or merchant ship availability, not as a deliberate tactical innovation based on mathematical optimization. U-boat tactical manuals were revised to account for larger convoys, but the guidance remained based on the assumption that bigger targets meant better opportunities. German commanders never grasped that the fundamental geometry of convoy operations had been weaponized against them through probability theory. They were playing a game whose rules had been quietly rewritten by a British physicist, and they didn't even realize the game had changed. The statistical impact of Blackett's insight became clear by late 1943. Merchant ship losses per convoy crossing dropped significantly. The amount of cargo successfully delivered to Britain increased despite no major increase in the total number of merchant ships or escorts available. The efficiency gain was exactly what Blackett's mathematics had predicted, moving the same cargo and fewer. Larger convoys with better escort density resulted in lower overall losses. The Admiralty's official historians would later estimate that the larger convoy strategy, combined with other anti-submarine innovations, saved approximately 2 million tons of shipping that would otherwise have been sunk if the old small convoy doctrine had continued. 2 million tons represented hundreds of ships and thousands of lives that survived because a mathematician proved that naval instinct was geometrically wrong. The broader implications of Blackett's work extended far beyond convoy sizes. He had demonstrated that operational research applying scientific methodology and mathematical analysis to military problems could produce insights that experienced military professionals would miss because those professionals were thinking tactically rather than analytically. Military experience taught you what worked in practice. Mathematics taught you why it worked and how to optimize it. The combination was far more powerful than either of them. Blackett's operational research group expanded to analyze everything from bombing tactics to aircraft maintenance schedules, and similar operational research units were established throughout the Allied military. The Americans embraced the approach enthusiastically, and operational research became a permanent fixture of military planning. The modern discipline of operations research, now applied to everything from airline scheduling to manufacturing optimization to logistics planning, traces its roots directly to Blackett's wartime work on convoy sizes and submarine tactics. For the U-boat crews hunting desperately for convoys in 1943 and beyond, the experience was one of increasing frustration and bewilderment. Their boats weren't less capable. Their torpedoes worked as well as ever. Their tactics hadn't fundamentally changed. But somehow, the Atlantic had become emptier, targets had become scarcer, and successful attacks had become rarer. Some U-boat commanders attributed it to improved Allied radar and submarine detection technology, which was indeed improving, but wasn't the primary factor. Some blamed changing weather patterns or convoy routing that avoided their patrol areas. Some suspected correctly that Allied code breaking was allowing convoys to evade U-boat concentrations, though this was only part of the story. None of them realized that a British physicist with no naval background had reduced their entire operational concept to probability equations, and found a mathematical counter that didn't require better technology or more escorts or lucky intelligence breaks. The counter was pure geometry. It changed the size of the target in a way that changes detection probability minimally, while changing defensive efficiency dramatically, and the entire strategic calculation shifts. Patrick Blackett received numerous honors for his wartime contributions, including eventually being named Baron Blackett and receiving the Order of Merit, one of Britain's highest civilian honors. But the specific contribution of the larger convoy insight remained classified for years after the war. And even when it was declassified, it never achieved the public recognition of other wartime innovations, like radar or the Enigma code. There were no dramatic photographs of convoy-sized calculations, no exciting stories of breakthrough moments that made good journalism. It was mathematics, abstract and invisible, producing results that were statistical rather than dramatic. Yet in terms of strategic impact, Blackett's insight ranked among the most important Allied innovations of the war. By changing how convoys were organized, he effectively reduced U-boat efficiency by a percentage that multiplied across thousands of convoy crossings, translated to millions of tons of cargo that reached Britain instead of sinking into the Atlantic. That cargo included food that prevented famine, fuel that kept the military operating, ammunition that supplied armies, and raw materials that fed war industries. The Battle of the Atlantic was ultimately a mathematical contest: good U-boats sink ships faster than shipyards build them, and Blackett's contribution was to change the equation in Britain's favor at a moment when the answer was uncomfortably close to no. The lesson that military institutions learned, slowly and reluctantly, was that warfare in the industrial age required more than courage, experience, and tactical skill. It required analytical thinking that could identify counterintuitive optimizations that traditional military training would never discover. Blackett's larger convoy proposal was insane, only if you thought tactically and instinctively. If you thought mathematically and probabilistically, it was obvious. The gap between those two ways of thinking represented thousands of lives and millions of tons of shipping. In the decades since World War II, the integration of operational research, systems analysis, and mathematical optimization into military planning has become so standard that it is difficult to imagine warfare without it. But in 1941, when Patrick Blackett walked into the Admiralty and told naval officers that everything they knew about convoy operations was geometrically simple, he was proposing something genuinely revolutionary. The fact that his insane idea worked exactly as his mathematics predicted, that it saved ships and lives on a massive scale, and that the enemy never understood why their tactics suddenly stopped working, that's the kind of invisible victory that changes the course of wars without firing a shot or building a new weapon. It was just mathematics, applied ruthlessly to a problem where everyone else was thinking conventionally. And it worked!